All right, let's see if we can get past the rest of chapter 2. Section 11, from religion to rustic ideal. Recourse can also be had to art as an illusory escape from conflict. In reality, social conflicts clearly emerge from the masterpieces of Aeschylus, Aristophanes, Dante, and Cervantes. In fact, this sometimes happens against the wishes of the author. Balzac ended up mercilessly describing the inevitable eclipse of his class, the aristocracy, for which he felt sympathy and pining nostalgia. Attempts to escape social reality and its contradictions can assume different forms, but all are alike are inane. After the failure of the 1848 revolution, criticizing a now forgotten author, George Frederick Dahmer, who expressed disdain for abstract, exclusive politics and who counteropposed to its miseries the beauty and warmth of nature, Marx and Engels mocked the widespread tendency to flee before the historical tragedy that is threatening to alleged nature, that is, to a stupid rustic ideal. End quote. In Feuerbach, too, disillusion and disgust were so strong in these years that he was led to repeat Cicero's exclamation about the politics of his time. Everything is full of every misery. It remained only to practice indifference toward political parties and chatter, seeking refuge and consolation in the arms of nature. Nature alone is not concerned with politics, but is the direct opposite of politics. Rather than religion, evasion or escape from the conflict now seeks safety in nature. Marx had already cautioned against this attitude 5 years before the 1848 revolution, when he observed that Feuerbach referred too much to nature and too little to politics. What has been said of escape into religion also broadly applies to escape into nature. Far from expressing a genuine transcendence of social conflict, it is an immature, often misdefined expression of that conflict. We are dealing with a spiritual attitude that tends to manifest itself every time the hopes reposed in politics and political change fade or vanish. This is what happened after 1789 when the extreme complexity of the revolutionary process seemed to have definitively mocked the enthusiasm initially elicited in German culture by the fall of the Ancien regime in France. In 1803, Friedrich Schiller had sung, quote, "Only on mountains is liberty to be founded. Only where nature was as yet uncontaminated by man is the world perfect." End quote. As a result, only he who lived in the silence of the countryside, suckling with childish abandon on the breast of nature, could be regarded as happy, or she who lived in the peaceful convent cell, where likewise the sad figure of humanity did not intrude, that is, where one was similarly far removed from the ephemeral din of his historical political upheavals. Hegel argued against Schiller and his invocation of nature. Rejecting any consolatory escape from the contradictions and conflicts of the political world, he stressed that what is created by human reason must possess at least the same dignity as what is created by nature. In this sense, the most banal Berlic wisecrack was no less worthy of admiration than a magnificent natural spectacle. This was a lesson which must have profoundly influenced Marx. According to the authoritative testimony of Paul Lafargue, the philosopher's son-in-law, having married his daughter Laura, he loved to repeat the saying by Hegel, the philosophy master of his youth. Even the criminal thought of a malefactor is more grandiose and sublime than the marvels of the heavens. In his turn, in a letter of 1893, Engels wrote, "Nature is wonderful. I have always liked going back to her as a change from the movement of history, but history, after all, seems even more wonderful than nature to me." Contact with nature should serve to revive energies, enabling a return with renewed vigor to observing the historical and political world and participating in building a society based on solidarity and an awareness of common humanity rather than exploitation and oppression. This approach, accomplishments of a thing never before attained in the history of our earth. This approaching accomplishment of a thing that never before attained in the history of our earth. We have seen Marx wax ironic about the alleged nature where the Philistine, disgusted with historical and political developments, thinks to find refuge. Such nature is alleged in two senses. First, it is not, in fact, uncontaminated by political and social conflict. Conservative circles appeal to it to reprove the irrational agitation of the city. Secondly, observe the German ideology in the planet inhabited by humanity, the nature that preceded human history, which is precisely conceived in contrast to human history, today no longer exists anywhere, perhaps on a few Australian coral islands of recent origin. The wait, hold on. Secondly, observes the German ideology in the planet inhabited by humanity, the nature that preceded human history, which is precisely conceived in contrast to human history, today no longer exists anywhere except perhaps on a few Australian coral islands of recent origin. The countryside where Schiller, Dahmer, and Feuerbach sought refuge had behind it a long, tormented history as well as a gigantic revolution, the Neolithic Revolution, which involved the introduction of agriculture and animal husbandry and the domestication of animals. In practice, everything celebrated as eternal nature, under the sign of order and regularity, and hence in contrast to the class struggles, agitation, and convulsions of historical and political world, is the product of a major historical upheaval. Contrary to Schiller's claim, even mountains are not uncontaminated by the sad figure of humanity. It is enough to think of shepherds and livestock which pertain to the history just invoked. In any event, to scale heights that are not easily accessible, it is necessary to employ what has been produced by human labor, starting with clothes to protect against cold and storms. The nature evoked by and dreamed of by Schiller, Dahmer, Feuerbach is nothing but the mental expression of a pious wish about human affairs, a fantasy projection of ideas that people would like to see realized in human society. Thus, it is a nature from which the dichotomy of life and happiness bemoaning human society has vanished. In reality, Hobbes had much better reasons for invoking nature as proof of his bellum omnium contra omnes, and Hegel for perceiving in nature cleavage. The only thing that can overcome the dichotomy of life and happiness is political action, class struggle. All right, 12. Nature between escape and class struggle. Marx and Engels ironize about attempts to seek shelter from the conflict in nature uncontaminated by human history and celebrate it in opposition to it. They criticize the evasion implicit in the cult of nature, as in religion in the strict sense. But all this did not prevent them being among the first to draw attention to what would today be called the ecological question. From the outset, Marx stressed that man lives on nature. The first premise of all human history is, of course, the existence of living human individuals, whose physical organization and consequent relation to the rest of nature cannot be ignored. Almost 30 years later, the critique of the Gotha program opens up with a caution that sounds prophetic today. However great and growing labor productivity might be, labor is not the source of all wealth. A key point must never be neglected. Nature is just as much the source of use values, and it is surely such that material wealth consists, as labors which itself is only the manifestation of a force of nature, human labor, power. We are immediately directed back to class struggle. While capitalism has the merit of promoting an unprecedented growth of the productive forces, it risks doubly jeopardizing real wealth. First, with its ruthless pursuit of maximum profit and periodic crisis, capitalism involves an enormous dissipation of the natural power that is human labor power, already sacrificed without scruple in children condemned to death from toil and hardship. It could be said that Volume 1 of Capital is in large part a critical analysis of the incessant human sacrifices from among the working class and the most reckless squandering of labor power. But that is not all. Capital elsewhere underscores that all progress in capitalistic agriculture is a progress in the art not only of robbing the laborer, but of robbing the soil, but by ruining the sources of its fertility. In any event, applied to the relationship between humanity and nature as a whole, the idea of private property on which bourgeois society is based proves even more devastating. The more absolute such an idea, the more serious the consequences for nature. In the American Deep South, slaveholding society was also characterized by brutal um, spoliation of the soil. As regards Ireland, the potato blight resulted from the exhaustion of the soil. It was a product of English colonial rule and the policy of colonial despoliation pursued by the London government. We may draw a general conclusion. Even a whole society, a nation, or even all simultaneously existing societies taken together are not the owners of the globe. They are only its possessors, its suf- usufructuaries, and like boni pot familias, I don't know, they must hand it down to succeeding generations in an improved condition. In future, from the standpoint of higher economic forms of society, private ownership of the globe by single individuals will appear quite as absurd as private ownership of one man by another. That is the relationship of slavery. We can now understand Engel's warning in Dialectics of Nature. We by no means rule over nature like a conqueror over a foreign people, like someone standing outside nature, but we, with flesh, blood, and brain, belong to nature and exist in its midst. To safeguard nature, which makes the continuation and development of human history possible, political social conflict, from which the religious cult of nature recommends escape, must be confronted and resolved. Appeals to look to nature for a place that transcends social disagreements and contradictions are a distorting, mystificatory expression of the very conflict they vainly seek to repress. Hmm. But let us nevertheless try to take such appeals seriously. We should first of all remember that the worker never gets the slightest glimpse of nature in his large town in his long working hours. Besides, the nature present in the working people's quarters of urban centers afford a desolate spectacle. They have been constructed without the slightest reference to ventilation, with reference solely to the profit secured by the contractor, and abandoned to the most miserable and filthy condition, and a shocking stench, with filth and swarms of vermin. Furnishing one of the very first analysis of the ecological and environmental questions, Engels noted how the logic of profit explained the pollution of the atmosphere. Witness a city enveloped in a great cloud of coal smoke. Of waterways, here we have a coal black foul smelling stream, and there are dark colored bodies of water which leaves the beholder in doubt whether it is a brook or a long string of stagnant puddles. The text just quoted dates from 1845. 2 years earlier, Herbert Spencer had ironized as follows. If the state is to be assigned the task of intervening against industries polluting discharges, why deny it competence as regards to the spiritual sanity of the nation? Some decades later, the English liberal had a rethink and felt obliged to come to terms with the problem of air pollution. He made some very modern sounding observations about the foul air people were sometimes forced to breathe on trains. But it is always and only individuals who appear on stage, and the problem is treated without any reference to factories and industrial locations or rivers, lakes, and the natural environment. The conflict emerges when the gentlemen, or rather men who think themselves gentlemen, smoke in other places than those provided for smokers. Classes and class struggle are as absent as ever. And this might be the last one for the chapter. Let's see. Yeah, including the chapter of the different forms of class struggle. Here we go. 13, a general theory of social conflict. We can now draw some conclusions, or we can draw some conclusions. First, by virtue of its ambition to encompass the whole historical process, the theory of class struggle is configured as a general theory of conflict. According to the Communist Manifesto, it is the history of all hitherto existing society. The history of all past society, which is characterized by the class struggle and class antagonism. Decades later, in 1885, Engels reverted to the theme. It was Marx who had first discovered the great laws of motion of history, the laws according to which all historical struggles are in fact only the more or less clear expression of struggles between social classes. I have emphasized the key word which identifies social conflict as such with class struggle, whoever its protagonists are and whatever form it takes. Secondly, effecting a radical epistemological break with naturalistic ideologies, the Marxian theory of class struggle situates social conflict on the terrain of history. Thirdly, precisely because it seeks to supply an interpretive key to the historical process, it strives to take into account the multiplicity of forms with which social conflict manifests itself. With this italic, I intend to signal a preliminary problem. Obviously, existence is marked by an affinity of conflict that develop between individuals for a whole variety of reasons. But what is involved here is analyzing conflict whose protagonists are not single individuals, but social subjects who, directly or indirectly, pertain to the social order, to some essential articulation of the division of labor and the social order. This is how the object of Marxist theory of class struggle is defined. We are dealing with a general category, a genus, which can subsume different species. We may venture a typology starting, obviously not from oral history, but from the historical time in which the authors of the Communist Manifesto lived. An initial distinction is indicated. On the one hand, there are conflicts that oppose the exploitation of classes, class struggles, that see the bourgeoisies of different countries rise up against the landed aristocracy of the ancient regime, and then confront one another in more or less fierce competition liable to result in war. On the other hand, we have struggles for emancipation, which are class struggles from the standpoint of social subjects engaged in achieving it and of those intent on preventing it or impeding it. At this point, we must make a second distinction, to be exact, a tripartite distinction between the struggle whose protagonists are peoples in colonial or semi-colonial conditions, the struggle waged by the working class in the capitalist metropolis, and thirdly, the struggle of women against domestic slavery. Each of these three struggles challenges the prevailing division of labor internationally, nationally, and within the family. A relational of compulsion obtains between capital and labor in bourgeois society. But the same is true of other two relations. The three struggles for emancipation challenge the three fundamental relations of compulsion constitutive of the capitalist system as a whole. Benedetto Croce took no account of all this when in September 1917, with reference to the war that was raging, he declared the concept of power and struggle which Marx transported from the state to social classes now seems to have reverted from classes to states. It is true that at the least in the early stages of the patriotic Union Sacrée, the gigantic conflict was regarded and theorized by not a few European intellectuals as further confirmation of the crisis of historical materialism or as an instrument to abolish class struggle. However, only a few weeks after the class struggle had been declared dead, the October Revolution and the insurrection of the popular masses against the war, and the privileged classes who ruled the country and army occurred in Russia. But that is not the only reason why the terrible trial of strength between the great powers, which erupted in 1914, was far from being the termination or suspension of class struggle. We should take special note of the observation made by an eminent contemporary historian, Arno J. Mayer. No war has ever been so ardently invoked as prophylaxis, as an instrument of domestic politics, as lifeline of a political and social order that felt to ever more imperiled by the rise of labor and socialist movements. To cite the example of a figure not far removed from Croce's circle 10 years before its outbreak, the war was invoked and summoned by Wilfred Pareto to set socialism back for at least half a century. In a similar vein, in Germany, Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz also justified his policy of naval rearmament by the need to discover an antidote to Marxism and the political radicalization of the masses. And this is not to mention the conviction, widespread among the dominant classes and their ideologues, that colonial expansion alone could diffuse the social question in the metropolis and weaken or contain the socialist movement. On closer inspection, the First World War was not merely an expression of the class struggle, but was so in a triple sense. It pertained to A, the struggle for hegemony between the capitalist bourgeoisies and the great powers; B, to the social conflict of the metropolis, which the dominant class hoped to neutralize and deflect via international confrontation and colonial conquest; and C, to the oppression and exploitation of peoples in colonial or semi-colonial conditions for whom the social question was posed as the national question. In each individual country, the ruling class certainly sees the opportunity to command or impose social peace and national unity, to suppress the strikes and, if needed be, extend working hours. However, far from betokenen its end, such a behavior was manifestation of the class struggle waged by the bourgeoisie, which subsequently, with the intensification of the sacrifices required by war and the progressive loss in credibility of patriotic rhetoric, the proletariat countered with a class struggle that could even take revolutionary forms. In the light of such considerations, Karl Popper's summary cannot but raise a smile. He expounds as follows the thesis that fascism and communism share an evil, obviously, obviously German father. The left wing, represented by Marx, replaces the war of nations with which appears in Hegel's historicist scheme by war of classes. The extreme right replaces it by the war of races. End quote. In fact, social and class conflict is very much present in Hegel, who constantly referred to it to explain the fall of the monarchy in ancient Rome, overthrown by an aristocracy determined to strengthen its hold over the plebs, or to shed light on the modern process that saw the absolutist monarchy progressively limit the power and privileges of feudal aristocracy, stubbornly attached to its privileges, and the serfdom and exploitation imposed on the peasants' mass. With the advent of the modern representative state derived from the French Revolution, social conflict had far from disappeared for Hegel. The proletariat who was unemployed or incapable of working, or the poor man who risked dying of starvation, was in similar condition to the slave and hence fully entitled to rebel. On the other hand, the War of Nations features prominently in Marx and Engels. Capitalism was also condemned by them because it secreted an industrial war of extermination between nations and waged piratical wars against colonial people, who responded with legitimate wars of resistance and national liberation. As for the War of Races, Marx and Engels certainly rejected interpreting interpreting history in racial terms. In so doing, they were compelled to argue not only against the phantom Hegelian extreme right fantasized by Popper, himself a prisoner of the ethnological paradigm in a way he pointed to Germany as a source of all evil, but also against figures and newspapers in liberal America and Britain. However, what at first sight presents itself as a racial war is in reality a class struggle. For example, it is clear in the USA of black slavery and white supremacy of the fate of African Americans was sealed primarily by racial affiliation. In such circumstances, to raise the racial national question did not in fact mean repressing social conflict, but confronting it in the concrete, particular terms in which it manifested itself. Only if we appreciate this can we understand the 20th century, which, as we shall see, was marked by the epic class struggles and national resistance struggles against attempts by the Third Reich and the Empire of the Rising Sun to revive the colonial, even slaveholding traditions in Eastern Europe and Asia, respectively. In short, what escapes Crochet, Popper, and Ferguson is the role played by class struggle in contradictions, clashes, and confrontations that seem purely national and racial in character. None of them appreciates what Marx and Engels' theory of class struggle is a general theory of social conflict, even if it's not organically and systematically expounded. We may proceed to a comparison. Likewise, benefiting from the extraordinary cultural season that witnessed the blossoming of German classical philosophy, Karl von Clausewitz wrote his celebrated book on war, which encompasses the most varied armed conflicts, interpreting them as the continuation of politics by other means. Marx and Engels, in principle, composed a treaty on social and political conflict, which, rising to a higher level of generalization and abstraction on the basis of the division of labor into antagonistic classes in the class struggle, interprets the various forms of social conflict, including wars and different types of war, in a unitary key. It should be at once added that while Clausewitz adopted an at least partially objectivist attitude, the two philosophers and revolutionary militants explicitly declared that they did not seek to rise dessous de la main, confining themselves to observing it with detachment, but were actively engaged in changing the world in a very precise direction. All right. Notes. All right. We can stop here.